Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight for the week and the subject of our deep dive is the condemnation of Pelagianism. The original anti-Calvinist, Pelagius was a theologian who believed in human moral responsibility and rejected the idea of original sin as taught by his opponents, his primary opponent being Augustine of Hippo. On April 30th, 418 AD, at the Council of Carthage, Pelagianism was officially condemned, and all Pelagians were banned from Rome. Roman Emperor Honorius issued the ban in an attempt to maintain religious and political unity within the empire. Our next historical highlight is Father Charles Coughlin, one of several unexpected allies that Germany gained during the 1930s as it fell to Nazi influence, and one of the first major political influencers in U.S. history, with a national radio program that reached 30 to 40 million listeners weekly. He originally supported FDR, but began to support the Nazi regime upon Hitler's rise to power. In 1934, Coughlin established the National Union for Social Justice and published a newspaper entitled Social Justice, which spread anti-Semitic and pro-fascist content. He resisted the New Deal and promoted the work of Hitler and Mussolini. The Catholic Church began to distance itself from Coughlin due to his extremism and anti-Semitism. In order to enforce church discipline and protect the church's witness, Edward Mooney warned Coughlin and his National Union for Social Justice to end their pro-Nazi movement on May 1, 1942, while the U.S. government pressured him to end his broadcasts. Our final historical highlight for the week is James Sharp, a controversial religious leader in 17th century Scotland. Following the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, Sharp was named Archbishop of St. Andrews, making him the head of the Church of England in Scotland and reimposing episcopal church governance. Formerly, he belonged to a group called the Covenanters, radical Presbyterians who signed the National Covenant in 1638 to resist Anglican control. The Covenanters advocated for a Presbyterian system of churches led by elders rather than bishops. When Sharp became aligned with the monarchy and Anglican structure, he was seen as a traitor. The outbreak of the English Civil War led to religious divisions among Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Puritans. This led into a period in the late 1600s known as the Killing Times, during which Covenanters faced heavy persecution in Scotland. Sharp was one of the persecutors. As tensions rose, he was assassinated on May 3, 1679. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Andrew Chronister of Kenrick-Glennon Seminary about the condemnation of Pelagianism.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of This Week in Christian History, and we are focused on right in or about April 30th, maybe a little bit of 1st of May, that would be in 418, when we are talking about a guy who is a theologian and who also has some good early on arm wrestling, let's just call that, internal to church doctrine about a host of different things: sin, grace, free will, what that actually looks at. And we're talking about Pelagius, but who we actually are visiting with today is Dr. Andrew Chronister, who is at, I'm going to make sure I get the title right on this, Dr. Chronister, the Associate Professor of Patristics and Ancient Languages at Kenrick-Glennon Seminary in St. Louis. So did I get close enough on that?
You got it perfect. Thanks.
Right on it. Very fine to be able to do that. That's great. So we don't want anybody to tune out because they think you're about to show us what Sanskrit's all about or something like that. So just hang tough, right, to do that. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us kind of the time frame and tell us about who these main characters are, if you will, in this story that we're talking about. This a pretty important conversation and dialogue, right? About what is the role of man and what do you have and what can you do and what can you not do. So let me be
Right.
quiet and let you talk.
Yeah. So in terms of the time frame, we're looking at the fourth and early fifth century. Um, in Italy, North Africa, the Holy Land, sort of all of these different places come into play at various points in the course of the controversy that we call the Pelagian controversy, which of course is named after Pelagius. So Pelagius was originally from Britain, we think.
Mm-hmm.
He ended up in Rome sometime, maybe right at the end of the fourth century, very beginning of the fifth century. And we don't know much about his background, but we know that he started to develop a following around himself. He was a sort of a strong preacher of asceticism. So this notion of doing different works and acts to sort of build up the virtues and sort of seek after holiness and these sorts of things. And so he's part of a broader ascetic movement within the fourth century. Of course, the fourth century sees a lot of changes for Christianity, right? Because at the beginning of the fourth century, we have the great persecution under Diocletian, and then all of a sudden, Edict of Milan, we have the legalization of Christianity. And
Mm-hmm.
so Christians' role and position within the Roman Empire suddenly changes, maybe not quite overnight, but very close to overnight. All of a sudden, it's sort of Christians are increasingly privileged throughout the empire. And so for some, it seems that sort of privilege that they have within the Roman Empire um, might might breed a certain sort of lukewarmness towards the faith. People, if
Mm.
if you don't have a danger of being killed for your faith, you might not take it as seriously, or there might be other reasons why you would become Christian rather than simply because you really believe in Jesus Christ. And so you start to see throughout the fourth century various figures come to the fore as sort of saying, hey, we need to take our faith seriously. We need to live a robust Christian life, um, live out the full demands of the gospel. So you have people like Saint Anthony of the desert in the desert of Egypt going out there and
Mm-hmm.
living in the wilderness by himself. And then later on, you have people like Jerome, Saint Jerome, and
Mm-hmm.
his former one-time friend Rufinus of Aquileia, and then you also have Pelagius. So there's a lot of different ascetic figures here running around doing this sort of like it's not quite monasticism, at least not for all of them, in the sense that they don't all have like individual monasteries. Jerome and Rufinus do, of course, and Anthony, of course, is doing sort of a hermit type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Pelagius was not part of a monastery per se, but he was sort of preaching to the Christians of Rome. And it seems like he has some sort of following around himself, especially among the upper class in Rome, the
Okay.
aristocrats. So,
But just for clarity here, though, he's
yeah,
not a priest, right?
he's not a priest.
Right.
No, he's just a layman.
Right. Okay.
And yeah, so sometimes he's called a monk. Scholars will debate how appropriate that term is because he wasn't part of a monastery.
Okay.
So people go back and forth on that, but that's sort of a helpful descriptor for him. So yeah, so he is developing this following around himself, and it seems like what's really motivating him is he wants people to take the gospel seriously, and he says, "Man, we've been given so many gifts. We have the gift of the scriptures, we have the gift of the example of Jesus Christ, um, and if we're not living out the gospel the way that we're supposed to be doing, really, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And we just need to, put into action the stuff that we know to be true. God has told us how he wants us to live our lives. And so we just need to, get down to doing it. And so he has this desire to present to the people that he's preaching to, hey, it's possible to avoid sin. It's possible to avoid sin. And so we just need to get out there and get to work on doing it. So this sounds like good stuff, right?
Right. Right.
But so yeah, it sounds like good stuff. And And initially, he's got a lot of positive acclaim around him. But people are also start sort of pointing out some issues with his program. And of course, the most famous of these sort of people that are pointing out problems with his program is St. Augustine of Hippo, right? So he's a bishop in the port city of Hippo Regius, which is in modern day Algeria. And he gets word about Pelagius. Pelagius at this point is still up in Rome. And he hears a lot of good stuff about Pelagius, but he also hears that Pelagius has been not taking the grace of God as seriously as he should. He's been opposing the grace of God. And so basically, it's sort of a long story, and I won't bore you all with all the details. But Pelagius ends up coming through North Africa and then travels over into the Holy Land. And in the course of this, a controversy erupts between Augustine and Pelagius and his sort of student or disciple or associate. Scholars will debate on how exactly to frame this, but a man named Celestius or Caelestius or Caelestius, depending on what pronunciation of Latin you're going with.
And this is Pelagius's associate student.
Right.
Right.
Correct. Yeah. So Pelagius and Celestius. And so this whole controversy erupts. And at the heart of it is this question of God's grace, but also, sort of backing up a little bit, the question of the human condition, and more specifically, whether humanity has a fallen condition. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they eat that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and bad stuff happens, right? The question is, what are those bad things that happen? Are Adam and Eve just presenting a bad example for all of us? Or has their sin in some way damaged human nature, or sort of changed the human condition in some way from what it originally was? And so someone like Pelagius, for example, would say, they've set a bad example for us, and we shouldn't sort of discount that. But there's nothing that sin of Adam has done. It hasn't done anything to human nature as such. It hasn't made it harder for us to avoid sin, these sorts of things. Whereas for Augustine, on the other side, he says, well, no. Adam's sin has damaged human nature. It's made us more inclined to sin. It's sort of alienated us from God. It's introduced death into the world, right? And so it's a lot harder for us to avoid sin than it was for Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. And so especially in this situation where we have such a wound, we need the healing of grace in order to help us to choose the good, to avoid sin, to love God and neighbor, and these sorts of things.
Wow.
So that's a basic synopsis.
Well, but now are Augustine and Pelagius, are they squaring off against each other in the same way that like Arius or Athanasius would, or there would have been others where there was, there was a showdown, right? I mean, or whether these conversations were actually taking place, or was it more just in writings, and how did all that kind of bubble up?
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question. So Pelagius and Augustine never had the opportunity to chat in person.
Okay.
Augustine tells us that he saw Pelagius from a distance, saw his face once or twice when they were both in Carthage, which is sort of the major city in North Africa near Hippo, where Augustine was the bishop. But they never have the opportunity to actually sit down and chat with one another, which I think is really unfortunate, because maybe things would have gone differently, and the thing would have been resolved more amicably if they had the chance to talk. But such is life. So the way that the controversy kind of plays out is Augustine gets access to some of Pelagius's writings, and he'll write against Pelagius what Pelagius had written. Pelagius's associate Celestius that I mentioned previously, he also never interacted directly with Augustine, it seems, at least as far as we know, but he was a little bit more of a lightning rod when he was in Carthage. So Pelagius kind of passed through Hippo and passed through Carthage without really drawing a whole lot of attention to himself. Celestius was a little bit different because when he came down through Carthage, he actually tried to get ordained a priest in Carthage.
Okay.
And as a part of that, so they didn't have seminaries back in the day. But Celestius wasn't a local guy, and so the normal practice at that point was to at least get some, you wanted to get some feedback from other people that were aware of this guy to make sure he wasn't crazy.
Sure.
And so there was actually a deacon from Italy who was present in Carthage, and he submitted some problematic statements that Celestius was accused of teaching. A lot of them have to do with sort of a denial of original sin. And so Celestius at that point was brought before a panel of bishops. Augustine was not among them. But this panel of bishops basically condemned Celestius for teaching these propositions. And so that's sort of the situation that actually gets Augustine to start writing against the Pelagians. There's a sort of Roman official in town in Carthage who asks Augustine if he would write some stuff about these positions that Celestius had been circulating. So all of this is taking place right around 411 or 412. And that takes us, we have sort of this initial sort of flare up of activity around 411, 412. And then everything kind of quiets down, in large part because Pelagius is no longer present in Carthage. He's gone over to the Holy Land. Celestius seems like he ended up in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey. And so it's a few years before Augustine starts to get word of sort of continuing Pelagian activity elsewhere. Things kind of come to a head a little bit more in 415, because at that point Pelagius has been in the Holy Land for a few years. He gets himself in trouble to some extent with some Western Christians who are also living in the Holy Land, people like Jerome and some others who are not fans of Pelagius. And so Pelagius is actually brought before a synod of bishops in December of 415. And people like Jerome and others are trying to get Pelagius condemned. Well, as it turns out, these Eastern bishops, basically none of the Western Christians show up for the synod. And so they have this sort of document in Latin that are listing these sort of positions that Pelagius is accused of teaching. There's nobody there to explain to the bishops what exactly these propositions mean or what might be problematic about them. So long story short, Pelagius is acquitted of heresy at this synod.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Andrew Chronister by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.